My girlfriend keeps hugging her ex-hookup and tells me I'm being unreasonable for feeling uncomfortable about it. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation. My name's Mike, and my girlfriend Sarah and I have been dating for about 8 months now. We met through mutual friends at a local brewery, hit it off immediately, and things have been great, except for one recurring issue that's been gnawing at me. You see, before we started dating, Sarah had a brief thing with this guy named Jake. It wasn't serious, just a hookup that happened about a year ago. No big deal, right? Well, it wouldn't be, except for the fact that we keep running into him. And I mean constantly. The first time it happened was at our local coffee shop, the Daily Grind. Sarah and I were waiting in line for our usual Saturday morning coffee when I noticed her tense up slightly. Before I could ask what was wrong, this tall guy with perfectly styled hair and the kind of confidence that seems to fill a room walked in. Sarah immediately brightened up, waving at him. "Jake. Hi." She called out, and before I knew it, they were hugging. Not a quick, awkward side hug, but a full-on embrace. I stood there, coffee cup in hand, watching as my girlfriend hugged a guy she'd previously been intimate with. When they finally separated, Sarah introduced us. "Mike, this is Jake. Jake, this is my boyfriend, Mike." Jake gave me a firm handshake and a smile that seemed just a little too knowing for my comfort. "Nice to meet you, man," he said, and I mumbled something similar in response. They chatted for a few minutes about mutual friends and some concert they'd both attended months ago. I noticed Sarah laughing a little too hard at his jokes, touching his arm occasionally as they talked. Nothing overtly flirtatious, but enough to make me shift uncomfortably from foot to foot. That first encounter was awkward but manageable. What I didn't expect was for it to become a regular occurrence. Our city isn't huge, but it's not tiny either. Yet somehow, Jake started popping up everywhere we went. We'd see him at the grocery store, at our favorite restaurants, at the park where we go for walks. Each time, the same routine would play out. Sarah would spot him, they'd exchange hugs, and I'd stand there feeling increasingly like a third wheel in my own relationship. After the 4th or 5th time this happened, I decided to bring it up with Sarah. We were having dinner at her apartment, and I tried to keep my tone casual. "So, we seem to run into Jake a lot," I said, pushing my pasta around my plate. Sarah looked up, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Yeah, I guess we do. It's a small world, right?" I cleared my throat. "About that. Does it seem necessary to hug him every time? I mean, a wave would probably suffice." She put down her fork, her brow furrowing. "Mike, it's just a friendly hug. Jake and I are on good terms, and it would be weird to suddenly start acting cold towards him." "I get that, but knowing your history." I trailed off, not wanting to sound jealous but feeling exactly that. "That was before you and I were together," Sarah said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "We're just friends now." I couldn't help but remember something she'd told me early in our relationship, before we'd started running into Jake regularly. We'd been playing a drinking game, trading stories about past relationships, when she'd mentioned him. "Jake? Oh, he was someone I would be intimidated by," she'd said, then immediately backtracked when she saw my expression. "I mean, he's just very confident, you know? But it wasn't serious or anything." Those words had stuck with me, and now they echoed in my head every time I watched them embrace. The run-ins continued, and so did my discomfort. We'd be at the local brewery where we first met, the Hoppy Brewer, enjoying a quiet evening when Jake would materialize, usually with a group of friends. Sarah would wave enthusiastically, and he'd make his way over. Sometimes his friends would join us, turning our date night into an impromptu group hang. One particularly memorable evening, we were celebrating my promotion at work. I'd reserved a table at the Rustic Table, an upscale restaurant downtown. Sarah looked beautiful in a black dress, and I was wearing my best suit. The mood was perfect, until I heard a familiar voice from the bar area. "Sarah? Mike? What are you guys doing here?" Jake, of course, dressed in a casual button-down that somehow looked more appropriate for the setting than my carefully chosen suit. He was there for a business dinner, he explained, gesturing to a group of well-dressed professionals at the bar. "Join us for a drink after your meal," he suggested, and before I could politely decline, Sarah was agreeing enthusiastically. So instead of the romantic nightcap I'd planned, we ended up at the bar with Jake and his colleagues, all of whom seemed to find him utterly charming. Sarah was particularly engaged, laughing at his stories about difficult clients and offering her own workplace anecdotes. I nursed my whiskey and tried not to notice how her body was angled towards him, how her eyes sparkled when he spoke. The next morning, I tried again to express my feelings about the situation. "Sarah, about last night. I began as we were having breakfast at her place. She looked up from her phone, where she was probably checking her work emails. What about it? Wasn't it fun? Jake's colleagues were so interesting. I took a deep breath. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about. I had planned for it to be just us last night. To celebrate my promotion. And we did celebrate, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. The dinner was lovely. Until Jake showed up, I couldn't help adding. She withdrew her hand. Mike, we've talked about this. Jake is just a friend now. You should try to be more friendly during these encounters. It's awkward when you're so quiet and withdrawn. I almost laughed at the irony. She wanted me to be more friendly with the guy she used to hook up with, the guy she found intimidating, the guy she hugged every time we ran into him despite knowing it made me uncomfortable. But life has a way of continuing, even when you're stuck in an awkward situation. We kept going about our routine, and Jake kept appearing in it. At the farmer's market on Sunday mornings, where he'd comment on the organic produce Sarah was selecting. At the local bookstore where Sarah and I liked to browse on rainy afternoons, where he'd inevitably have a book recommendation that Sarah found fascinating. Even at the gym, my gym, where I'd been going for years before I met Sarah. She'd recently joined because they had better yoga classes than her old gym, and somehow, Jake was there too. I'd be in the middle of a set, look up, and see them chatting by the water fountain, Sarah in her yoga pants and Jake in his perfectly fitted workout gear. One day, we were at a mutual friend's birthday party at the Copper Pot, a popular bar downtown. I was at the bar getting drinks when I overheard two of Sarah's friends talking. They seemed so natural together, one said, and my ears perked up. I know, right? Sometimes I forget they're not actually a couple, the other replied with a laugh. I didn't need to ask who they were talking about. From my vantage point, I could see Sarah and Jake engaged in what looked like an intense conversation. She was gesturing animatedly, and he was leaning in, nodding along to whatever she was saying. As I watched, she reached out and touched his arm, letting her hand linger for a moment too long. I grabbed our drinks and made my way back to the group, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. When I handed Sarah her glass, she barely seemed to notice, still caught up in her conversation with Jake. Hey, babe, I said, perhaps a bit louder than necessary. She turned to me, looking slightly startled, as if she'd forgotten I was there. Oh, thanks, she said, taking the drink. Jake was just telling me about this amazing hiking trail he discovered. We should check it out sometime. I forced a smile. Sure, sounds great. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed at my place, I decided to try one more time to address the issue. Sarah, can we talk about something? She was removing her makeup in my bathroom, and I could see her reflection in the mirror as she replied, of course, what's up? It's about Jake, I said, and I saw her shoulders tense slightly. Mike, not this again. Just hear me out, I pleaded. I know you say he's just a friend, and I believe you. But the constant hugging, the way you light up when he's around. It makes me uncomfortable. Especially knowing your history. She turned to face me, makeup wipe still in hand. What do you want me to do? Pretend I don't know him? Cross the street when I see him coming? No, of course not. But maybe just tone it down a little? A wave instead of a hug? And maybe we don't need to join him every time he invites us? Sarah sighed, tossing the makeup wipe in the trash with perhaps more force than necessary. I think you're being unreasonable. Jake is a friend, and I'm not going to change how I interact with my friends because you're insecure. That word, insecure, hit me like a punch to the gut. Was that what this was? Was I just being insecure? The next few weeks passed in a blur of more Jake encounters. At our regular trivia night at the Brainy Brew, where he joined our team and helped us win first place with his encyclopedic knowledge of obscure facts. At the local music festival, where he coincidentally had VIP passes to and spent the day moving between stages with us. At the opening of a new art gallery where Sarah's friend was exhibiting, where he showed up in a perfectly tailored suit and spent the evening discussing art in a way that made Sarah hang on his every word. Each time, the same routine played out. The hug, the animated conversation, the inside jokes I wasn't part of, the lingering touches that might mean nothing but felt like everything to me. And each time, I felt more and more like an outsider in my own relationship. It all came to a head one evening when we were having dinner at my place. I was cooking, something I enjoyed doing for Sarah, when her phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it and smiled, typing out a quick response. Who was that? I asked, trying to sound casual as I stirred the risotto. Oh, just Jake, she replied, putting her phone down. He's thinking of organizing a group camping trip next month and wanted to know if we'd be interested. I put down the wooden spoon I was using and turned to face her. Sarah, can we talk about this? Really talk about it? She must have heard something in my voice because she looked up from her phone, her expression serious. What's wrong? This thing with Jake. It's not working for me. The constant run-ins, the hugs, the way you drop everything when he's around. I've tried to be cool with it, but I'm not. Sarah's face hardened slightly. We've been over this, Mike. Jake is a friend. You're being possessive and, frankly, kind of controlling. Controlling? I repeated, incredulous. How is asking my girlfriend to respect my feelings about her physical contact with a former hookup controlling? Because you're trying to dictate who I can be friends with and how I can interact with them. Her voice was rising now. Do you not trust me? Of course I trust you, I said, although I wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. But this isn't about trust. It's about respect. And honestly, Sarah, sometimes it feels like you respect Jake's feelings more than mine. She stood up from the kitchen counter where she'd been sitting. That's ridiculous. You're my boyfriend, Jake is just a friend. A friend you used to sleep with. A friend you once described as someone you'd be intimidated by. A friend you can't seem to go a week without hugging. The risotto was definitely overcooked by now, but neither of us was thinking about dinner anymore. I can't believe we're having this conversation again, Sarah said, running her hands through her hair in frustration. What do you want from me, Mike? Do you want me to cut Jake out of my life completely? No, I said, although a small part of me wanted exactly that. I just want you to understand why this bothers me and maybe consider my feelings when you interact with him. And I want you to understand that your feelings about this are unreasonable, she countered. Jake is part of my social circle. We're going to run into him. I'm not going to pretend he doesn't exist or treat him coldly just because you're jealous. We stood in my kitchen, the silence broken only by the gentle bubbling of the neglected risotto. I turned off the stove, the symbolic gesture of a ruined evening. Maybe we should take some time to think about this, Sarah finally said, gathering her purse and phone. I'm going to head home. I didn't try to stop her. As the door closed behind her, I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the ingredients of a dinner we wouldn't eat, wondering how we'd gotten here. How a series of coincidental encounters and friendly hugs had managed to create such a rift between us. The next few days were tense. We texted, but our usual easy banter was replaced by formal messages about work and plans. We had dinner once, at a neutral location, a new restaurant where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew, especially Jake. The conversation was stilted, both of us dancing around the elephant in the room. A week passed, then another. We were still together, but something had changed. The easy comfort we'd had before was gone, replaced by a watchfulness, a wariness. Every time we went out, I found myself scanning the crowd, tensing up at the sight of any tall, confident-looking man with styled hair. And of course, because the universe has a sense of humor, we did run into Jake again. At the grocery store, of all places. Sarah was examining avocados when I heard the now familiar voice. Sarah. Mike. How are you guys? I watched as Sarah's face lit up, as she moved in for the hug. But this time, something was different. The hug was briefer, less enthusiastic. And when they separated, Sarah moved back to stand closer to me. We're good, she said, her hand finding mine. Just doing some shopping. How are you? The conversation was shorter than usual, more superficial. When Jake moved on to the produce section, Sarah squeezed my hand. I've been thinking, she said quietly as we continued shopping. Maybe you're not entirely wrong about the Jake thing. I tried to keep my voice neutral. Oh? Yeah. I mean, I still think you're being a bit sensitive about it, but I can see how it might make you uncomfortable. The hugging and everything. It wasn't a complete concession, but it was something. As we finished our shopping and headed home, I felt a little lighter. Not because I'd won, this wasn't about winning, but because finally, Sarah was seeing things from my perspective, even just a little bit. That night, as we were cooking dinner together, properly this time, no interruptions, Sarah brought it up again. You know, when we hooked up, it was just a thing that happened. It didn't mean anything. I nodded, focusing on chopping vegetables. And when I said he was intimidating, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. He just has this way of making everything seem easy, you know? But that's not real. Nobody's life is actually that perfect. I put down the knife and turned to her. I know. And I'm not asking you to stop being friends with him. I just want me to be more mindful, she finished. I get it. And I'll try. No more hugs, okay? Just waves and quick hellos. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As we sat down to eat, I realized something. The Jake situation wasn't really about Jake at all. It was about us, about communication, about respect, about finding that balance between maintaining friendships and respecting your partner's feelings. We're still working on it. We still run into Jake sometimes, it's inevitable in a city this size with overlapping social circles. But now, when we do, Sarah gives him a wave and a quick hello. Sometimes we stop to chat, sometimes we don't. And I'm working on my part too, trying to be less tense, more friendly during these encounters. It's not perfect. Sometimes I still feel that twinge when I see them talking, still wonder if there's more there than just friendship. But relationships aren't about perfection. They're about growth, about learning to navigate the complicated terrain of two lives intersecting, about finding compromises that work for both people. And as for Jake? He's still around, still popping up in our lives with his perfect hair and easy confidence. But he's just another person in our social circle now, not the source of tension he once was. Last week, we ran into him at the Hoppy Brewer again. Sarah gave him a quick wave, we exchanged brief pleasantries about work and the weather, and then we went back to our date night. No drama, no lingering discomfort. The funny thing is, once the tension around Jake dissipated, I started noticing other things. Like how Sarah always makes sure to include me in conversations, even when we're with her friends. How she talks about our future together with such certainty. How, when she introduces me to people now, she says this is Mike, my partner, with a warmth that makes any lingering insecurities fade away. We're not perfect, no couple is. We still have our disagreements, our moments of tension. But we've learned to talk about them, to find compromises that work for both of us. And in the end, that's what matters. As for the guy she used to be intimidated by? Well, let's just say that sometimes the things that seem so threatening in the moment have a way of working themselves out. These days, when we run into Jake, it's just another encounter in our day, nothing more, nothing less. Sarah and I are planning a trip together next month, our first real vacation as a couple. We're going somewhere neither of us has been before, creating new memories that are just ours. And that's what I've learned through all of this. Sometimes the best way forward is to stop looking back. So here we are, moving forward together. And if we happen to run into Jake or anyone else from our past along the way, well, we'll handle it, together. Because at the end of the day, it's not about who you run into, it's about who you come home to. And I'm grateful that for me, that person is Sarah.